Hello, everyone. Thank you all for coming, and thank all of you watching online on Ustream and on KEI's website. My name is Nicholas Hamasevich, and I am Director of Research and Academic Affairs here at the Korea Economic Institute. It is my pleasure to welcome you to KEI for our academic paper series event today on After Kim Jong-il, Politics and Security. We are excited to have Dr. Hyung-Gu Lynn from the University of British Columbia with us here today to provide his thoughts on the transition to Kim Jong-un and on some of the political and security aspects of North Korea. After Kim Jong-il's death, one of the main questions was, can Kim Jong-un survive? He has survived so far and appears to want to celebrate the end of the year with a satellite launch, which North Korea announced over the weekend. As Dr. Lin describes in his paper, rocket launches are one of the many tools Kim Jong-un and the collective leadership are using to stay in power. And as other countries involved in Northeast Asia begin or start to begin their transitions, it will be important to understand the political and security dynamics in North Korea in order to analyze and gauge the possibilities for engagement and or conflict in the region in 2013. With these important topics and issues, we are thankful to have Dr. Lin write this paper and provide his thoughts. Dr. Hyung-Gu Lynn is the AECL KEPCO Chair in Korean Research at the Institute of Asian Research at the University of British Columbia in Vancouver, Canada. He is also the editor for the journal Pacific Affairs. Prior to joining the Institute of Asian Research at UBC in 2002, Dr. Lin held positions at Hitotsubashi University and Hanyang University. Dr. Lin has also been a visiting professor at Kyushu University and Seoul National University. He received his PhD from Harvard University and his MA and BA from the University of British Columbia. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Hyung-Gu Lynn.
Okay, first I'd like to thank Abram and Nicholas and the KI for inviting me to speak to you today. Is this fine? Yes? Okay. And to thank all of you for joining us today. I don't know if 10 a.m. is the regular scheduled time for your talks, but it's 7 a.m. by my body time, so you'll have to bear with me if I occasionally yawn through my own talk. Okay, so what I'd like to do is to emphasize certain aspects of the paper rather than to go over the paper point by point. So the question is, how politically stable is North Korea after Kim Jong-il? So we're coming up on the 1-year anniversary of his death. And there are two, you could say, predominant views. One is immediate collapse. Now, almost every year you'll find some observer predicting imminent collapse, since probably the 1990s, at the very least. So there's several reasons why people make this prediction. One is, well, the youth and inexperience of Kim Jong-un. The second reason that's quite often invoked is the power of the Korean People's Army, the military in North Korea. A third reason is that the economic situation is so dire that there will be an immediate collapse. And the fourth reason, I think, is wishful thinking. So people who are interested in regime change look for evidence of regime instability. The second option, probably a minority view, is that there is essentially, for all practical purposes, a perpetual rule by the power of the ideology or due to a variety of tools for societal control and political oppression. So this is obviously a picture of Kim Jong-un from October 30th. Okay, so my own answer to this is, you could say, intermediate. So based on my analysis of the speed, scale, and scope, variety, the clever use of precedents, and adherence to the principle of equilibrium in the various policies that Kim Jong-un has implemented, I would predict that it would be safe to say that North Korean political system will be stable for the next 5 years. Now you could say, why 5 years? Well, it's an intermediate guess. I would suspect that there's a 5-year window for providing greater supply of food, and if the food supply situation is not addressed, if the food shortages and malnourishment is not ameliorated, there would be another wave of social unrest, probably on a greater scale than we saw in 2009 after the currency reforms. Now, there are several other reasons why I would make this projection. The first is that the selectocracy, the elites, currently don't have the incentive or the organizational ability to mount an institutional opposition movement. Currently, there's little incentive for a coup. Now, if you think about the various exit scenarios for authoritarian regimes, one is an elite coup, another would be mass demonstrations, another could be external shock or intervention, or random assassination. So usually, of course, there's some combination of these four factors. And we can think of Park Chung-hee, the longtime authoritarian ruler of South Korea, who was assassinated by his head of intelligence in 1979, essentially out of the blue, as one example of a random assassination that we could really not have predicted. So what I like to do in the, 30 to 40 minutes I've been given is to quickly outline some of the points I raised in my paper. So a very brief overview of the approaches I've taken, and then an overview of what I call the mass distractions, policies directed towards the regular citizens. So mass distractions plus mobilizations and controls. And then a section on elite differentiations. And then a section on foreign policy diversifications. And within that, I include things like missiles and nukes. And then in the last section, in the paper, I believe I call it economic reforms. But I would say maybe the more accurate descriptions, alterations, like going to a tailor. The suit remains the same. There's some marginal adjustments, alterations. Okay. Very simply, in analyzing political stability, there are various quantitative models that we can invoke. So the most probably famous one is the Political Instability Index. I'll show you a screen capture of the rankings, but there are various quantitative models, and some of them don't include North Korea at all because of the quality of information is so poor. And others rank North Korea as a surprisingly stable country, and others rank it near the top. Another approach that's at the opposite end of the spectrum is more micro, so tracking who appears with Kim Jong-un where. I know of one scholar who's taken every single publicized image of Kim Jong-un in North Korean press and compared the physical distance between Kim Jong-un and Jang Sung-taek, his uncle, and Choi Yong-hae, who's another leading figure. So he's measured the physical distance. So that's a very micro approach. Okay. So my approach is somewhat more qualitative or intermediate, so it's not quantitative. I don't have a large population sample of authoritarian regimes that I'm comparing. I'm also not interested necessarily in these micro analysis in and of themselves. I think they can be useful, but they need to be contextualized. And I've also made a concerted effort to use North Korean, South Korean, Japanese, Chinese, and other sources, not necessarily because reading North Korean propaganda is enjoyable. I don't know how many of you read it on a regular basis, but it can be quite persuasive in a repetitive kind of way. But simply because I think it's useful to know what the official North Korean propaganda is. And quite often, a lot of the predictions of imminent collapse is based on inability to access some of the information that North Korea itself is producing. Okay, so very simply, I would just maybe suggest that we keep these typologies in mind. North Korea, some people argue, is National Socialist. Some people say Stalinist, Hermit Kingdom. In a sense, I don't think it matters too much whether it's left or right. I think what matters is that over the decades, North Korean leaders have employed a range of policies to ensure or foster high levels of loyalty and also high levels of fear. So this is one standard typology. This is a new amusement park. His wife, Lee Seol-ju. The picture on your right is of a new apartment complex called Changjeon Road. that looks like something out of Seoul's Gangnam area. And it has electricity, as you will see, and running water. Okay, so this is a night shot from a Chinese press of the same complex. So Kim Jong-un makes an effort to be seen guiding the construction of all these facilities. A final point about why this particular initiative is clever is that there are articles and newscasts recounting how Kim Jong-il, for example, before his death on a cold December day, walked through the amusement park to make sure that the park was in good condition and people were enjoying themselves. And this was just 10 days before he died. And there are all these kinds of posters, again, invoking Kim Jong-un's lineage, the history of the Kim family. So these public performances allow for public invocation of Kim Jong-un's lineage and history. So it's not all amusement parks and fun and games, obviously. There are mass mobilizations. So there are two segments of the population that Kim Jong-un has emphasized that his father had, relatively speaking, ignored. The first is youth, the Youth League, and the second is women. Okay. So there is a Youth Day, August 27th, but Kim Jong-il, in November 2010, a month before his death, appeared at Youth League events for the first time in 10 years, again, to help Kim Jong-un emphasize his connection with youth. And Kim Jong-un has made a concerted effort to organize various Youth League assemblies and to attend almost every single Youth League associated concert. So all youth between 14 and 30 in North Korea are required to join the league. Okay. Though this was in theory. The ones who are actually active and participating are usually related to the Korean Workers' Party, the Korean Socialist Party's elite. But this is actually a very large organization, and after the Korean Workers' Party and Korean People's Army, this is the single largest in population organization in North Korea. Kim Jong-un, of course, is youthful. He's 28 or 29, perhaps 30. And he's using his youthfulness to connect with the Youth League. Women and mothers are also featured more prominently, so this is part of mass mobilizations. North Korea had celebrated International Women's Day that UN has set for these years, but this year they established a new holiday, which is Mother's Day. I don't know how many of you are familiar with this, but they established Mother's Day for November 16th. It was announced officially back in September. And there's a big, of course, great deal of celebration and assembling concentrated around the new official holiday. Okay, so these are just images of what happens during Mother's Day. There was an assembly before, it's called the Mother's Assembly. And mothers are taken, of course, to an amusement park to enjoy, again, the benefits of the caring and, I suppose, the care and the warmth of the new leader. Okay. Youth League. This is, I said 14 to 30. These are, I think, at the lower end of the spectrum, the younger end. They're also taken to amusement parks after their assembly. These are older youth who are mobilized to work at construction sites. Okay. Another, I suppose, aspect of social mobilization, especially towards women, or of women, is the fact that Kim Jong-un made bicycle riding for women legal this August. It had been banned for about 10 years by his father. Now you could say, what does this mean? Well, in fact, most women in the countryside had been riding their bicycles, especially when going to the market. But now it's legal to do so, right? Older youth being mobilized. Okay, so there's mass mobilizations. Now, on Mother's Day, there's also a concerted effort to apotheosize his grandmother. So this is Kim Jong-il, the young child, Kim Il-sung, and his wife, Kim Jong-suk. And on Mother's Day, there's quite a bit of propaganda centered around Kim Jong-suk. And this leads to the final point about why these mass mobilizations are relatively clever in that they, I would say, adhere to an equilibrium. By this, in this particular instance, what I mean is that there's no attempt to make a living goddess out of his own mother, Kim Jong-un's mother, Ko Young-hee. Now, how many of you are familiar with Ko Young-hee? Yeah. Okay. So she was Korean born in Japan, a dancer, and never officially Kim Jong-il's wife, but she had two sons, Kim Jong-chol and Kim Jong-un. And what happened was in June, they released a film, a biographical film of her, making her into the national mother, and showed it to elites in the Korean Workers' Party. And on the basis of that showing, screen testing, they decided that there was too much risk involved in showing a film without mentioning the mother's name at all or her background. So she's Korean Japanese, which means that she's at the lower rung, lower end of the social strata within North Korea. And there are accusations that her father, so Kim Jong-un's maternal grandfather, had worked in a munitions factory in Japan in 1930s, and that would make him a traitor by North Korean standards. Either way, presumably on the basis of rational calculations, they decided not to show this film to the public after the screening. So again, it's not just random, it's not just desperate. There's a calculation behind these policies towards the regular citizens. Now, mass controls, of course, have been strengthened. Kim Jong-un has made an effort to visit various police and judge assemblies and urged these people to be observant and diligent in pursuing and punishing all criminals, especially anti-state, anti-Kim Il-sung activities. The number of border patrols have been increased. So the usual number that's invoked here is that defectors who reached South Korea in 2011, so some of these people might have been in China for 4 years as well, but as a rough point of comparison, there's about 2,700 defectors from North Korea who reached South Korea in 2011. In 2012, up to the end of October, this number is 1,200, roughly. So if we estimate that maybe by the end of the year there might be 1,400 or 500, there's still quite a significant decrease in number of defectors or refugees from North Korea reaching South Korea. Now, you could argue that it's because Kim Jong-un has done such a great job with the amusement parks that people want to stay, but given the reports we have about the food shortage, the food prices, exchange rates between Chinese yuan and the North Korean won, it's rather unlikely that that's the case. It's, I think, safe to say that border patrols are one of the biggest reasons why you have this drop in number of defectors reaching South Korea. There's also a relatively new trend, which is this recruitment of re-defectors, people who left North Korea to go to South Korea and get either coerced, recruited, or persuaded to return to North Korea. So one observer has estimated that there was actually over 100 such cases in the first half of 2012 alone. There's also a new, I suppose, ideological slogan. Some of you may have heard this already. It's called the untrodden snowpath spirit. So it first started appearing right after, I would say, Kim Jong-il's death. And then in July, there was an editorial that featured this untrodden snowpath spirit as a new, I suppose, slogan for this new age. And then there was a front page editorial in October, which essentially cemented the status of untrodden snowpath spirit as a new slogan for Kim Jong-un. Essentially, it's like the difficult march, right, that Kim Jong-il was invoking in the 1990s. Okay, these are just images of some of the re-defectors, people who re-entered North Korea. So this couple lived in South Korea for 4 years. And they said, well, they had quite a miserable time in South Korea. They have a very young baby. And they re-entered North Korea and had a press conference. The woman to your right, her South Korean name is Park In-suk. Park Jung-suk is her North Korean name. Had, I guess, one of these press conferences. And there's considerable speculation that she was actually forced to go back to North Korea because her son was essentially being held hostage. She defected by herself, and North Korean agents had approached her, and she was convinced that it would be best for the entire family if she returned. And now these people have these press conferences and are shown entering their new apartments that they had been given by Kim Jong-un's spirit of largesse. There was another press conference held by another re-defector who claimed that he had been sent in to destroy the new statues of Kim Il-sung and Kim Jong-un. Yeah. Okay, and of course, we can invoke all kinds of international agreements that North Korea itself has signed as reasons why many of these human rights violations, I suppose, are certainly not desirable. But what's ironic, of course, is that the North Korean Constitution itself guarantees freedom of speech, press, assembly, demonstration, association, freedom of religious belief, freedom of movement, and residence. Okay, so this is, of course, the old Kim Il-sung statue. The new statues, for the most part, are now dyads. Right? They feature Kim Il-sung and Kim Jong-il. This is one that was unveiled at the end of October in front of the Kim Il-sung Military University. And the original monotheistic statue has been updated. So Kim Il-sung now smiles and is wearing a necktie, okay, rather than the workers' clothes. As you can see, he also has glasses. So again, there's renovation and invocation of old myth and propaganda. Okay, so let us then turn to elite differentiation. So this is a favorite topic of many North Korea watchers. Who's demoted, who's promoted? So this is just an image of what I would call the current triumvirate. Kim Jong-un, the ruler, Chang Song-tak, his uncle, so his Kim Jong-il's sister's husband, and Chae Yong-hae, with the blue circle around him, who is, I suppose, the current supervisor of the Korean People's Army. Another picture. So these are during happier times. Lee Young-ho, who was dismissed from all posts in July. This made quite a bit of news, I think, around the world. Probably the most powerful figure in the KPA at the time, standing next to Chae Yong-hae. And Kim Jong-guk is another general who was recently removed from his post as defense minister or minister of the army. So this was during a happier time. This figure shows you, I suppose, the simplified picture of the North Korean administration. I would just point out that under military first politics, in de facto terms, the National Defense Commission, essentially, I suppose the head of the military had the most power. But legally, under the Constitution, the 2009 Constitution is the latest set of revisions, the Workers' Party, Central Committee, and the Cabinet have the same legal rights. Yeah. So there was never any legal mechanisms that made National Defense Commission more powerful than the Cabinet or Workers' Party. So when people talk about Kim Jong-un abandoning the military first politics, it's important to recall that this is in de facto terms, okay, rather than de jure terms. And also, he does maintain the rhetoric of military first politics in many public speeches. So some amusement parks are called legacies, treasures, benefits of the military first politics period. Okay. So I won't go into all the details about who got promoted and demoted, but essentially you can look at it as Kim Jong-un exercising control over the army and implementing generational change among KPA officers, the army officers. So Kim Jong-un cannot afford to alienate the army. So if there are discontented generals, he has to remove them quickly. At the same time, if there are too many changes, this may alienate the army. So he needs to maintain balance, equilibrium. So one estimate is that around 30% of all officers have been changed, some retired, some removed, since April. So this is a graph you may have seen or a picture. This is Kim Jong-il's funeral, December 28th. So there are 8 people who were the hearse's guardsmen in this case, all men. So Kim Jong-un, who was at the head of it, is still doing fine, apparently. Chang Sung-taek still holds a lot of power. It probably has increased his power since Kim Jong-un became formally the head of the state. Kim Gi-nam, who's the third in this particular picture, still holds a lot of power despite the fact he's 86, I believe. Now, given the fact that people are living longer, the fact that he's 86 certainly should not prohibit him from being active politically, but it is still amazing that he actually travels quite a bit, despite his advanced age. Okay, Che Dae-bok, fourth in that particular picture, also has retained many of his positions. So the first, on the military side, Lee Young-ho, has been removed from all posts and has not been seen since July 16th, and there's all kinds of rumors about his current whereabouts. So most reports indicate that he's actually under house arrest. Some claim that he had been in a hot springs resort in the north under hot springs arrest, I suppose. Okay. The second person in line, Kim Young-chun, was removed as the Minister of the Army in April. He actually still appears in public events, but without any cabinet posts. Okay, so Kim Jong-gak, who you can't see, the third, is the one who was removed as a defense minister in October. And Woo Dong-chuk, the fourth in that particular picture, hasn't been seen since March 2012. Okay, so the 4 top generals as of December 2011 are no longer in positions of significant power. Since that particular analysis has been done to death, actually, by all kinds of media in South Korea, I decided to take a slightly different tack, which is that I found this particular picture. Now, there's all kinds of graphs like this that you can find, especially in Japanese and Korean newspapers. This one happened to be relatively prescient, in that all these people are still, except for one, Park Nam-gi, are still alive. So I decided I would do a similar analysis with this particular graph. Or picture, I suppose. Okay, so Kim Gi-nam you saw actually in the Hearst picture. Park Do-chun has been promoted. Kim Gyok-sik, who's the new defense minister, is seen as a hardliner, was demoted and then promoted to 4-star general, and then now he's minister. Lee Myung-soo has retained his position as Minister of Police, a position he had in 2009. And it may be coincident, may not be, but he was actually very close to one of Chang Sung-taek's older brothers, okay, who was a vice marshal in the Korean People's Army, died in 2009. Okay. Kang Seok-ju, who many of you may be familiar with because he was the one who tended to appear in many of the, I suppose, English language broadcasts, is I suppose he's been vice premier since 2010, so he was ostensibly given a promotion, but he doesn't seem to have that much active power, influence in decision-making these days. He was last seen in September at an opening of a factory, looking actually surprisingly aged, although he's one of the youngest people in that particular picture. Okay, Hyun Chore, he's actually a vice marshal, not marshal. Hasn't been since October. So some South Korean media and intelligence claim that he might have also been forced into retirement. Kim Jong-gak, we talked about before. Park Nam-gi is the Korean Workers' Party figure who was in charge of the 2009 currency reforms, and he was famously executed in March. And official North Korean publications that were released in October this year have confirmed that he was in fact executed in March 2010 for allegedly trying to introduce South Korean-style economics. So for those of you who are familiar with the currency reforms, it's nothing remotely like South Korean economics. Okay, but that was the official line. Okay, so in actuality, you could say currently it's a triumvirate plus this one general who I would suggest isn't that powerful, but he's the chief of general staff. So the highest ranking figure within the Korean People's Army, but he's supervised by Choi Young-hae, who's at the back there. So most people would agree that the real power is held by Kim Jong-un, his uncle, and Choi Young-hae. And one of the reasons why the North Korean specialists in South Korea who analyzed the physical distance between Kim Jong-un, Chang Sung-taek, And Chae Young-hae is that he is operating the assumptions that these are the three most powerful people, and people who are most proximate physically to Kim Jong-un wield more power. Okay. So some people have claimed that, well, Chang Sung-tak is going to take over power eventually, but you have to keep in mind the ideology of North Korea is based on bloodlines, the Kim family's bloodlines, and Chang doesn't share in that bloodline. He's married to Kim Jong-il's sister, but he himself is not of that family. Now, it's true that Chang Sung-tak is probably the most influential figure now, but and partially because he doesn't have any major rivals currently. Okay? His main rival died in 2010 under allegedly mysterious circumstances, a traffic accident. Okay? So the ideology, so some observers claim that this is what allows North Korea to remain stable. I think it's useful to think of ideology as a political system. I don't know that it ensures long-term political stability, but this is the legitimation myth that North Korea is using. So Kim Il-sung is the founder of the nation. Okay? He's the progenitor of North Korea. And Juche, of course, is the official ideology. Okay? And so when someone says, well, we should give up Juche, North Korea should give up Juche, it's a bit like someone saying America should give up democracy. And it's important to understand this distinction. It's not saying give up on the Republicans or Democrats. It's like saying giving up on democracy to most North Korean elites. Okay, so skipping to foreign policy diversification. So it's, as has been the case for as long as we can remember, probably to the late 60s, there's a combination of attempts to diversify sources of funds, technology aid, and also maintain tensions. So I won't go into a lot of details about the outreach efforts focused on ASEAN, but there was a series of visits starting around May, and it's continuing now. I would say Indonesia and Singapore in particular have been targeted as potential sources of investment and aid. Singapore is North Korea's third leading trade partner. Okay? So it's not Russia and it's not Japan. It's Singapore. Reaffirmation of ties with Syria. So this has, of course, provoked quite a minor wave of coverage in English. And I go into this a little bit more detail in the paper, but it's actually part of a series of official exchanges. So on the commemoration of the founding of the Korean Workers' Party, Bashar al-Assad sent a congratulatory message to North Korea. They also sent an economic team to negotiate a cooperation pact. And then on November 16th, Kim Jong-un sent a congratulatory message to al-Assad on the commemoration of his father's coup. North Korea call it the rectification movement, not coup. So, of course, you could say that it's two dictators bonding, which is true. But if you look at the rhetoric, it's all posited in terms of anti-imperialism and autonomy. So we who resist imperialists in the West should stick together. And also, I celebrate your father's accomplishments, this kind of thing. Now, the reality is that North Korea is largely dependent on China still. About 90% of all economic exchanges occur with China. So it makes sense, of course, that they're seething internally, privately, and they want to diversify sources of funds and aid. I don't know how many have seen these films. There's a film that was released at the Busan International Festival called Comrade Kim Flies. It's about a woman who wants to become a trapeze artist. Anyone seen this? No. Okay. So there's another film, the first film that was a joint venture between China and North Korea about dancers developing a friendship that was released this year. Okay. There's also outreach attempts with Japan. So there were talks with Japan in Mongolia in November, and there's actually supposed to be follow-up talks scheduled December 4th and 5th, which have been put off. There are, of course, confrontations. Okay, so on November 22nd, North Korea repeated a threat to bomb Yeonpyeong-do again if South Korea conducted military exercises around the island. So hardly the picture of sensitivity and caring, right? And of course, you have the missile test in April, now one scheduled for December. If you read the newspapers in North Korea, they're constantly protesting over South Korea's purchase of PAC-3 missile defense system. Yeah. So they're very sensitive to South Korea's improvements in military, although they never protested South Korea's sales of the Golden Eagle supersonic fighter to Indonesia, interestingly enough. So they know what their priorities are. There's also spy activities. Many of you may have seen that feature from CNN, I think it was last week, about a North Korean spy with his James Bond-like assassination tools. Yeah. The actual arrest occurred September 2011, right, not September this year. But there are apparently all kinds of spy activities that North Korea still engages in. Again, there are lots of precedents. 1970s and 2000s are the two periods that seem most similar to what's happening now. This is, I suppose, a figure who may not be as well known in English language circles. His book gets quoted in English translation, but this is Fujimoto Kenji, pen name, who's apparently Kim Jong-il's personal sushi chef. And he was the first person to say that Kim Jong-un, young Kim Jong-un at the time, would likely be the next leader of North Korea. Okay, this is back in 2003 or so that he first started making these statements. And I should acknowledge that I predicted Kim Jong-chul, his older brother, would be more likely to be successor, because at the time, Kim Jong-chul actually held posts in the Korean Workers' Party, whereas Kim Jong-un did not, but obviously I was wrong. Okay, so he actually visited North Korea in July and had this tearful reunion where he confessed I guess the traitor had returned. And there's all kinds of controversies about whether his son had been killed off or not. But there is actually a constant stream of foreign policy maneuverings and tactics. I'm not sure what they all accumulate to, but certainly Kim Jong-un has been keeping busy. Okay? And then, of course, these kinds of posters still are present in North Korea, right? So this one is saying America is the evil country, not us, right? And then, yes, cheerleaders. Okay, so end games. Now, nuclear red herring, what does this mean? Well, when you consider the geopolitics, conventional weapons hold South Korea and Japan hostage anyway, right? So in a sense, if you think about potential end games, as soon as North Korea uses or actually launches even a conventional attack, I would suggest that America has to let North Korea know that the only logical response is an all-out attack on Pyongyang. So ultimately, the end game of using these weapons would be destruction for the regime. So I think it may be more logical, if not appealing, to think about this in terms of, not necessarily game theory, but in terms of what the potential negotiating priorities may be. So, for example, with the missile launch, there's lots of concern about whether it will be successful or not, whether it'll be able to reach California or not. Well, I would suggest that I wouldn't be surprised if it fails, if it's launched at all. But even if it fails, again, North Korea does hold South Korea and Japan hostage through conventional weapons. So in a sense, we should probably, if people are to be concerned, it should be about exports of missile parts or nuclear weapons components rather than the actual potential for delivery. Okay, now we'll quickly go through the economic implications because to some extent, many of these reforms haven't been analyzed, they've been described. So I'll have to go through this very quickly since I'm over time. So integration of economic controls under the Korean Workers' Party, also the cabinet. Return of older economic bureaucrats who have been ousted before and have now been recruited back in. They're actively benchmarking various types of economies. So Singapore is one, Indonesia is one. You may have heard that there are some North Korean faculty studying in Canada, studying market economics. Yeah. There's a program that's the second year in running. But there are continuing problems with food supply. So in a sense, what I had suggested at the very start, I think still applies. These images of Kim Jong-un visiting factories and so forth are actually less important than providing food. These are just two economic bureaucrats that were re-recruited back in to the party. And food shortages, I think, are more difficult to address than building a factory. Okay, so I think Aidan Foster Carter's paper, he talked about how the fact that Moscow cut off aid is the main cause of famines. I would suggest it's far more complicated. So natural causes, soil exhaustion, lack of seed variety, energy shortage, which leads to fertilizer shortages, domestic distribution issues, and so on and so forth, help create the food shortage issue. It's not just one factor, and I think we need to understand this. Okay. Now, there are a set of reforms announced within the party in June, and these have not been made public. So there are abortive attempts to try to increase market economics within the nation, create more incentives, and diminish the responsibility of the government in distributing food. Okay, so all reports indicate that there is, in fact, a food shortage still. Okay, and this is a picture, not from the 1990s, but August 2012. Kim Jong-un visits various army outposts, and this is an Navy coastal defense outpost, and many of the soldiers look quite thin. And there's a recent defector, a North Korean soldier, who is 180 centimeters tall, so quite tall by North Korean standards, and 46 kilograms, so he's quite thin, emaciated. So to skip to the conclusion, is North Korea likely to be politically stable? Well, again, despite the caveats about information, I would suggest that for the next 5 years, it's better to bet on political stability than not. Okay? And then by what criteria do we judge political stability? Well, I don't think it's useful to simply say that North Korea is oppressive or it's not, or that North Korea has various tools to control its population. I think we should start with the assumption that North Korean government has various tools to control, mobilize its population, but think about one level deeper. So I would suggest, given the speed, scope, scale, variety, continuity, maintenance of equilibrium in these various policies, it's safe to say, again, that North Korea, Kim Jong-un's rule would be politically stable. I said not desirable, but stable for the next 5 years. What about the economy? I think this is a big joker card. If food supply issues remain during the 5-year window and are not addressed, I think there could be some increased probability of instability after 5 years. Okay, thank you.
All right, thanks, Dr. Lynn. Let's get right to your questions. We have microphones, so if you would please raise your hand, state your name and organization, ask a question, and we can get right to it. Anyone want to try out the first question? Right here.
Hi, I'm Komei Sozaki of CSI's visiting fellow. I have 2 questions. One is, you mentioned about mass mobilizations, about creating a youth league or youth day, a Mother's Day. Are these all Kim Jong-un's own ideas, or does he have any advisors that recommended this? The second one is the military leaderships. You mentioned the 4 powerful military generals forced to retire or just retired because from the to stable economic policies. Is there any repercussions from the military side? Thank you.
Sorry, could you repeat the last part of the second question?
Is there any repercussions or rebuttals from the military about retirement or the change of generations? Thank
you. Okay, so thank you for the questions. So with regards to the first question, are these mobilizations part of, and actually mass distractions, all Kim Jong-un's ideas? I would suggest that these ideas were based on precedents, largely set by Kim Jong-il, and also efforts starting in 2010, after Kim Jong-il had started recovering from his stroke, to set the ground for Kim Jong-un. So they're not entirely his own ideas. But I think he's clearly made more public visits. So in North Korea, there's 2, as you know probably, there's 2 different kinds of inspections. There's on-site guidances, which only the supreme leader can make, and on-site, literally called understandings. So the Korean is yohei, which is ryokai in Japanese, and which is understanding the leader's will and transmitting. So that's done by other figures, not the supreme leader. So if you just track the number of on-site guidances and inspections, they greatly outnumber anything done by Kim Jong-il, even when he was in good health. So Kim Jong-un is a much more public figure, more man of the people, I suppose. And that element, I think, is something that he has come up with himself. So he's stressing his youthfulness and energy and vigor. Okay. Now, with regards to reactions from the KPA, so there's rumors, of course, that there was a shootout when Young-ho was arrested. But I would suggest that if there had been organized resistance, you wouldn't see people like Kim Yuk-sik, who's not the new defense minister, being re-promoted and happily taking the position of Minister of Defense. And there are several other cases of people who've been demoted and re-promoted within the army. So I think there's reports of discontent, but no organized resistance or opposition. And this is because all the incentives are still wielded, granted by Kim Jong-un and his family. So they know that if they're loyal enough, they could get re-promoted. So discontent, yes. Anything nearing opposition, probably not.
Okay. Other questions?
Thank you for your informative and insightful presentation. I'm Junior Nishino from the Woodrow Wilson Center. How do you see the Kim Jong-un regime in terms of the Kim Il-sungism or Yoil-Sasan 체계, which does not allow other people to exercise power? As you mentioned now, everyone knows that Chan Son-taek is really powerful. But in terms of the Yoil-Sasan 체계, actually, this does not match North Korean traditional political regime. So you mentioned Kim Jong-un regime will be stable in 5 years, but maybe Kim Jong-un have to try to seize power in the political circle. So how do you see this situation? Thank you.
So the question is whether there would be potential for tension, a clash between Chang Song-taek and Kim Jong-un. Yes, and this does not match North Korean political tradition. How do you this much? Yeah, I think it would be very difficult for Chang Song-taek to ever seize power and come to the public front. As you mentioned, I think your answer was embedded in your question, which is to say that given Kim Il-sungism, so in the Constitution, Kim Il-sung is the founder and progenitor of the nation, and his descendants are of the royal bloodlines. So this is part of the reason why they can appoint the aunt, Kim Kyung-hee, his Kim Jong-un's sister, as a general without triggering too much opposition. So Chang Song-taek has networks, I think, within the People's Workers' Party, Korean Workers' Party, and also in the army still, inherited, I suspect, from his older brothers. He had 2 brothers who were officers in the army. But given all the public narratives of legitimacy are based on bloodlines, I would suspect it would be very difficult for Chang Song-taek to actually take over power. So some people, one observer in South Korea claimed that given the speed with which Chang Song-taek has eliminated rivals in the army, it's only a matter of months before he gets rid of Kim Jong-un. He'd have to set up a new narrative. He'd have to set up a new political system to create authority and legitimacy. It's as, imagine if there's an American politician who became president without an election, right? So given that the ideology is based on Kim Il-sungism and bloodlines, I think Chang Song-taek will have to be very careful in maintaining a balance between exercising his power and not overreaching it, even with Kim Jong-un himself. So I would say even within 5 years, Chang Song-taek's power would not increase. I think Kim Jong-un's influence over decision-making will likely increase over the next 5 years. But I wouldn't see any fundamental difference in that dynamic. And I would add that if anything, if someone of that triumvirate has to be sacrificed, the first to go will be clearly Chae Yong-hae. He's the most disposable. And according to some accounts, he's the person Lee Young-ho, the general who was ousted in July, hated for various reasons. And Chae Yong has a bit of a sordid past as well, which is a sore point with some of the elites.
We'll start in the back, and we'll come up.
Hi, my name is Richard Shin. I'm with Economists Incorporated, it's an economic research firm. I have three-part questions, and it all involves economics, being an economist. First question is with your, you mentioned possible scenarios as food shortage, and I'd like to add to that, possible money problems that Kim Jong-un may have. They may not have the same resources as before. And finally, the reliance on China. And so my first question on the food shortage is, at what level do you expect the regime to collapse or have major problems that will, that you're talking about in terms of regime collapse or some kind of coup d'etat or some other regime collapse? Second question is, how has Kim Jong-un been able to maintain this kind of personal financing and keeping loyalty of his advisors and his underlings, basically? You mentioned Section 39. Is that still active? Is he still getting that kind of money that his father was getting or Kim Il-sung was getting? And then what kind of impact would that have eventually in the political system? And the third question is the reliance on China. Back, I remember back when I think North Korea did a missile test, China cut down or stopped, pipelines in the context of repairs and whatnot, and that had a major impact on the way North Korea thought about reliance on China. And I was wondering, could such thing, the breakdown between China-North Korea relationship occur, and what kind of impact would that have on the stability of the regime?
Okay, thank you. Very interesting questions. So first, with regards to food supply levels, the easy answer, a bit of an, I suppose, a cop-out, you could say, is that I don't think there's a bright line, legal term. There isn't a single point above which or below which I think people will suddenly rise. So if you keep in mind the difference between relative and absolute poverty, we can assume, I think, given controls over information, that even if people see Kim Jong-un eating well, people in the countryside are less likely to actually do anything about their dissatisfaction. Now, I liken it to, let's say, maybe a vice president of any country's entertainment account as opposed to the average per capita income in that country. And even in democracies, you'll see a huge disparity, but you don't see many people saying we should dismantle democracy as a result, right? So then if I'm predicting that within 5 years, the food supply situation has to be improved, and we know that about 50% or more of the food supply for regular citizens is obtained through black markets, then at what point, yes, would there be potential for political instability? And I have to say, not clear, I guess is an easy answer. So the information we have is that price of rice has doubled since April. And the exchange rate with the Chinese yuan around the border areas has also, decreased unfavorably for North Korea by a factor of 2. So if things start deteriorating at that rate, certainly there will be a problem within 5 years. If you imagine prices rising by a factor of 2 from about 500 won equivalent to 1,000, and next year it could be 2,000, but let's say it's not exponential. Let's go up to 1,500. I think by the end of 5 years, there will be serious issues. So, and I suspect that Kim Jong-un actually knows this. So people expect the Chinese-style economic reform. I'm not sure that's going to happen, but he knows that he has to address the food issue. He can't have people going to amusement parks if there's, starved and essentially dying. I mean, he actually does apparently mobilize people to go even if they're starved. But, okay. So the second question. Personal connections, so gifts and personal funds. So room 38 and 39 have been collapsed and then essentially expunged. So there is no longer room 38 or 39. So one was officially located in the party, the other in the army, and both have been eliminated. So all controls over personal funds have apparently been consolidated under the Central Committee of the Workers' Party. So there's specifically economic bureaucrats who apparently handle that aspect of revenues now. In terms of gifts, some people like to track the number of imports of watches from Switzerland. Okay? So there's a line, I think, in the paper. So the gifts are, there's been a tradition of giving like Victorinox watches, these Swiss Army watches to officers on an annual basis. So it's not Philippe Patek. So there's a difference between $200 and $10,000 watches, I would suggest. But apparently that's enough, along with better food supply. So if you look at studies done by people who've talked to recent defectors, you can see that there's some people who receive considerably more food than others, and it's usually based on political, social rank. So all this is to say that apparently, from all indications, there's still enough resources for Kim Jong-un to reward the loyal, not just through titles and positions, but also material resources. And that the elimination of Room 38 and 39 have only, in fact, helped make the system more efficient, from what we can tell at this point. So previously, what Room 39 had been in the army, the other one had been the party. Now it's under centralized control. Of course, there's things like sanctions. Yes, sanctions on luxury goods. So the sushi chef, the Japanese sushi chef, took over bluefin tuna when he visited North Korea to make sushi for Kim Jong-un and family. And bluefin tuna, yes, is one of the banned items for export. It's a luxury item. So that's apparently a bit of a concern for people in the foreign ministry in Japan. Reliance on China. Yes, I would agree that the largest potential for a direct exogenous shock is China cutting off all support. And I think that's unlikely to happen, especially with the new ruling 7 in China. We'll say 9, okay. So if you recall, there's, I guess he's number 3 on the rosters in the CCP now. There's a fellow who got his graduate degree from Kim Il-sung University, who's known as an economic conservative. And given his track record and the track record of some of the other officials in the top 7, it's unlikely that China will actually withdraw all support from North Korea at any time soon, is my guess. You may know more about this than I do. But North Korea, as you pointed out, is certainly wary of its over-reliance on China, and I think that explains in part the Southeast Asian push. So they went to Singapore and asked for investments for Dajin development projects. So on the one hand, they're sending local emissaries to China. So there's all kinds of friendly exchanges at the local level, national level. Chang Sung-taek has gone to China. But I think there's a reason why North Korea is sending more people, students, and faculty to various countries, including Canada, because they want to diversify their, I suppose, basis of economic support. So on that point, I wouldn't disagree. I would merely add again that it's, to my mind, it's unlikely that China would withdraw all support within the next 5 years.
Okay, and we have one up here.
Thank you for your very informative presentation. I'm Agla from CNS DC office, and I wanted to ask you to talk a little bit more about the exports relating to the nuclear program in particular, and perhaps arms in general. So just several questions to throw out there. You mentioned the personal relation that continues between the Syrian regime and Kim Jong-un. So how is that playing, and sort of in terms of channeling the revenues? Is that where part of it is coming from? And finally, there was an interesting sort of trend in the UN report on the DPRK that for the first time, I think there was no sort of caught cargo of miraging steel. And some people have voiced the hypothesis that perhaps comparable to the North Korean Vinilon, there has perhaps been some kind of a special material there has been talks of that North Korea has been developing, which may not necessarily be miraging steel, but perhaps could be a substitute. So just along these lines, if you could make a few comments. Thank you.
So, yes, with regards to export of missile components, then you're probably aware of the seizure back in May of the, I guess they're the graphite cylinders, 445, I believe. Yes, that were seized in Busan port on a Chinese ship headed towards, I believe it was Syria, yes? So there are attempts to export missile parts And I think what's interesting about North Korean writings on Syria is that they don't just look at it in terms of personal relations, anti-imperialism, and autonomy. They also introduce at not great depth, relatively surprising depth, I suppose, analysis of Syria's oil industry or IT industry. So I think there are economic incentives for North Korea to export missile parts. It's one of the few things they can export other than primary resources, primary goods. And I think they see Syria as a source for potentially diversifying its energy supply. Now, I'm not sure how realistic an assessment this is, but certainly that seems to be incentive. And this is what was behind the announcement on November 5th of the Syrian-North Korean Economic Exchange Agreement. So there's an agreement announced to strengthen economic ties. And it didn't mention missiles, but it did mention increased trade and investment in general terms. Now, of course, you have to keep in mind that North Korea signs these kinds of agreements with Malaysia, Mongolia, several other countries. But clearly there's evidence that they've been exporting missile parts to Syria, whereas they haven't been exporting missile parts to Mongolia, as far as we know. So I don't know, again, that it's just personal connection, but I think there's some economic calculations by economic bureaucrats in North Korea that help create incentives, motivations to continue to try to export missile parts to Syria. With regards to substitute materials for steel, I have to say I don't know that, and I don't really know anything about a potential substitute material. You could say the difference is that with Vinalon, given that the patent was initially recorded in the 1930s, and there's quite a bit of buildup in propaganda towards the actual mass use of Vinalon, and adherence to it long after it was discovered it wasn't that practical. Given that we haven't seen anything analogous, like no big announcement of a substitute product, one might assume then that given available evidence, there isn't actually a substitute material for anything. Unless you have information, right?
Other questions? Yeah, we'll go over here.
Stanley Kober, I'd like to pursue this bloodline, why people obey. Because if you look around the world now, look at Syria, but, or Egypt. Hosni Mubarak was grooming his son. They're both in jail. In communist societies, it wasn't the bloodline, but still, Mao designated Wagwa Fang as his successor. Didn't last. Khrushchev was overthrown by the guy he was grooming, Brezhnev. And even in the American example, you said, an election confers legitimacy, and that's true. But what happened with the election of 1860? The South seceded. Why hasn't there been this sort of an opposition? Over 2 generations like this, what makes the bloodline so acceptable?
Yeah, very interesting question. So first, I would say that North Korea is not a communist country. This has been debated for some time, but you could call it a socialist country. You could call it a Kim Il-sungist country, but I don't know that it's communist. But certainly, it's rather unusual in the fact that it's been able to implement 2 successions. So Kim Jong-il in essentially 73, and Kim Jong-un now, without any kind of uprising. So what is the secret of their success in retaining power? I would say the first distinction that has been made between personal dictators that we might think of in Africa and North Korea is that there is a systematized bureaucracy. There is an administrative organ. So the bureaucrats and the party and the army all help with the administrations. There's an established system of administration, but you could say that about lots of other governments, you could say. Information control is another. So South Korea, I think quite correctly, is ranked as the least informationally open country in the world by most of these indexes. So information control is another. Effectiveness of propaganda is another. And I would say the lack of resources of masses, I think, is another. That is to say, if you're a dictator, you don't want the citizenry to become too wealthy or too poor. So in fact, some people say that Kim Jong-il claimed to Eric Honecker that it's actually better if workers are poor because it makes it easier to control them. And you could say that, in fact, it's a relative economic impoverishment that means that people are more interested in feeding themselves, not changing the political system. As long as they're getting food, they're reasonably content. So you could say, yes, it is, in fact, economic impoverishment that helps explain, in part, the longevity of the regime. I think having convenient and very visible enemies, such as the United States and South Korea, helps also strengthen the propaganda. So if you think of Orwell's 1984, Oceania in Europe had ongoing wars, and it was actually more useful for domestic purposes than the actual, any foreign policy objectives in and of themselves. So I would suggest that's another reason. Now, if someone said, well, is there one factor that really makes North Korea distinct than the other, I would say, well, I'm not sure that there is one factor. I would say the easy answer is there's a combination of factors that distinguish North Korea from Egypt, Syria, a number of other examples you mentioned. Now, again, this is not to say that, therefore, North Korea will remain politically stable for perpetuity. I don't think that's a particularly reasonable position to make. Again, if you recall that in 2009, there were uprisings protesting not the system itself, but the currency reforms, which wiped out many people's savings, then there is some room for social opposition. But again, it's not against the system. It's about a specific economic policy. So, for example, we can have people criticize a Republican candidate or Democratic candidate, but relatively few people, to generalize, criticize the system itself, right? So there are a few people apparently who put in lobbies to secede from, or specific states to secede from the United States, but these are peripheral responses to election results. And I would say if you talk to most defectors from, or refugees from North Korea, the amount of pride they take in their country, amount of loyalty they still retain, I think is quite surprising. So again, empirical evidence suggests that they're still loyal. It's not, because quite often the South Korean handlers put limits on what kind of questions you ask refugees. Then you can't ask, well, why did you defect then? But again, many factors, combination of factors, not one factor. But it's something I'll definitely have to think about some more.
Got a question in the back?
University of Pennsylvania. I apologize for coming in late. I was on New York Avenue for half an hour. I want to make this as difficult as possible. The basic question is, how do we get them back to the table? The leap year agreement, the missile launch, obviously, and I've heard people in state say vociferously that it was a common understanding this was not to be done. North Korea said this was already a foregone conclusion. There was inertia. It was going to happen. The next launch in December, is this next one part 2 of actually what was April, or is it, a new stage in this? And in the interim, we've given South Korea the green light to increase the range of their missiles, and all their neighbors between Japan, China, and South Korea are putting missiles into space. So it makes it very difficult. If you're North Korean, you can make a case that we're getting lied to again, and it's a little bit uneven, and I don't want to take up their cause. But we can go on framing it for half an hour. The question is, how do we get everyone back to the table? And I think, and this is argumentable, that all parties want to get back to the table. What's it going to take?
Yeah, a difficult question. So going back a few steps, so with the leap year agreement, what was interesting is if you were reading the North Korean media, there was not a single reference to the agreement in public that I could find. Maybe there were, but I couldn't find any in the mass newspaper. So there's a newspaper for different segments of the population, but nothing public. I suppose, contrary to expectations, there was all kinds of criticism about the nuclear summit that was going to be held in Seoul in March. So there's constant criticism about that. And actually, I wrote a very short piece predicting that they would launch a missile in April, given that most of the public declarations focused on criticizing this head of states meeting in Seoul in March and had no mentions of any agreement with the U.S. I think that was a lucky guess. And in fact, people thought it was actually wrong, so they refused to publish this. Okay. But unfortunately, again, I would concede that was a lucky guess. I mean, it's just a guess. So if I were to make any suggestions for getting North Korea back to the table, it would simply be guesses, however informed or uninformed they might be. And I would suggest one step might be to try to bring back IAEA, NPT into the picture. So in a sense, by foregrounding the six-party talks, multilateral agreements that expand beyond the six regional interests have been excluded. Now, North Korea remains the only country that signed on to NPT and withdrew. And one of their positions, as you know, is that NPT has actually led to denuclearization by the U.S., maybe by Russia, but not the U.S. So therefore, there were logical reasons why we withdrew from the NPT. So again, bringing IAEA and NPT back into the picture might be useful. And they could be represented as a seventh party at a seven-party talks. I think I would actually say that the six-party talks might be dead. I mean, there's all kinds of bilateral talks going on anyway, informal ones. And I would suggest those might be more productive at this stage than a six-party talks. And from the U.S. perspective, if denuclearization remains a top issue or preventing proliferation, then I think it may in fact be more effective to engage in bilateral talks rather than have Russia and China at the same table. Now, Japan is a bit of an interesting player. Despite the fact that they're on board with anti-missile defense and denuclearization as priority issues, I think domestically the hot item remains the abduction issue. And again, bringing Japan into the picture in a six-party talks, I think dilutes the message that State Department wanted to give to the North Korea. So something along the lines of a new leap year agreement, but one that you can monitor and track. So if you know that there's no announcements in North Korean media, there's warning signs, that kind of thing, might be the most effective solution. So of course, some people say you should not reward North Korea with bilateral talks for being a threat. I would say if that's the case, then there's probably not going to be any negotiations that are productive in the future. So bilateral talks. Informal, formal, doesn't matter, I think. And in fact, that's what's happening in actuality now anyway. So.
Okay. Last question right here.
Paul Choi, Council on Foreign Relations. My question is, given your emphasis on the importance of propaganda as well as lineage, I'm wondering how important are domestic perceptions that Kim Jong-un is a capable leader? In particular, what happens domestically if, and I predict it well, a second rocket launch will fail? Does this discredit him as a military leader, and what are the repercussions?
Okay, so if you recall, interesting question, 2009 currency reforms were undertaken as a gift to the people from Kim Jong-un. They executed, of course, not Kim Jong-un, but the bureaucrat, the actually high-ranking one, Park Nam-gyu, who's responsible for the currency reforms. So with the missile, should it fail and should they need a scapegoat, it will certainly not be Kim Jong-un. Now, in terms of perception, I think many media outlets have actually received or have obtained interviews with people living in North Korea, not people who've defected, complaining about lack of food. But usually what they say is, well, because he was young, we expected new reforms and a change. So his youth was actually not seen as by some people, as a negative. In 2009, when they first started circulating internally to the party, propaganda saying that Kim Jong-un could drive at 100 miles or 100 k's an hour at the age of 3, I believe it was, maybe it was 6. Are you familiar with this propaganda? And then when he was, I think, 9, he picked up a gun and shot 100 bullseyes with a pistol. So this propaganda was circulated internally, and according to grumblings heard by Sodan, Korean, Japanese, who are affiliated sort of with North Korea, delegations, some of the people they met, some of the party elites thought not the propaganda was ridiculous, but that he's too young. Kim Jong was too young. What has he accomplished? So they're worried. But they didn't say they're worried, therefore he shouldn't be the new leader. They said he's worried because he's young. Other people, again, expected that there would be improvement because he was young. So ultimately, I would say, given that there are plenty of scapegoats around, as long as he's providing food and continue to produce propaganda, he won't be questioned in terms of legitimacy. So again, it's one thing to complain about a leader. So for example, you can criticize the President of the United States and so he hasn't delivered on his promises, but it's another thing to question the entire system. And I think because the system and the individual have become essentially merged into one in North Korea, it's difficult for people to say, well, we should get rid of the entire political system. You can complain about specific policies. Things haven't improved under Kim Jong-un, or he doesn't have enough experience. But very few people end up saying, well, we should get rid of the entire Kim family. Now, Hwang Jung-il, the highest-ranking defector on record so far, criticized Kim Jong-il, but he never criticized the system. So he was quite conservative. And if you're right, he wrote multiple books, and he was always attacking Kim Jong-il, but he never criticized Kim Il-sung or the system they constructed. Kim Jong-il had corrupted the system, but again, never the system itself. And I think it's important to keep in mind that complaints, again, don't equal critiques of the system, and that, in fact, vociferous attacks on individual leaders don't necessarily amount to the same thing as a critique of the system either. No one's actually come out and critiqued Kim Jong-un to the extent that people have critiqued Kim Jong-il, but we'll see.
Well, I think that's all the time we have. First, I want to thank you all for coming to look at the politics and security factors in North Korea after the death of Kim Jong-il. Just a reminder, our academic paper series had this two-part mini-series on North Korea after Kim Jong-il, and this was a great second part. Last month, we had the first part with Aidan Foster Carver examining the economic aspects of North Korea. You can find that video of the program and that paper on our website, www.keia.org. This has been a valuable discussion, and I think some of the insights discussed here today will be helpful as we watch North Korea to see if it will launch that rocket in the next few weeks, and to see how others will respond to it and events in 2013. Again, thank you for coming, and now please join me in thanking Dr. Hyung-Gu Lynn for his interesting presentation and excellent discussion.